welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Torah Graduate School of Jewish Studies, a leading academic program in Jewish studies that equips students with the tools to search out their own unique path into the study of Jewish history and thought. Based in New York City, the Torah Graduate School of Jewish Studies provides a supportive environment and personal attention from world-class faculty, seminar-style courses, one-on-one mentorship opportunities, and career advancement guidance. Students can study in person or complete the program online from anywhere in the world. Offerings include a Master of Arts degree in Jewish Studies with concentrations in Jewish history and Jewish education, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Jewish history, literature, and thought. Those who wish to audit specific classes of interest are welcome to do so as well. For more information on admission to the Torah Graduate School of Jewish Studies, including generous scholarships, please visit gsjs.toro.edu. That's gsjs.touro.edu. Call 212-463-0400 extension 55580 or email karen.rubin@turo.edu, and you'll find that information in the show notes below. This episode is also sponsored by Amudim. Unite to Heal, Amudim's annual 36-hour live stream is happening December 7 to 8, and it's become the most watched Jewish event of the year. Everything you'll see is original. Real conversations, real Torah, real mental health insight with some of the most respected voices in the Jewish world. One highlight this year is Dr. Yehuda Sabiner, the first Ger Chassid in Israel to ever become a doctor, who then went on to serve in the IDF. His story, his perspective, and the way he bridges worlds are remarkable. There's also a major panel called Uncharted Territory, featuring Rabbis Ephraim Goldberg, Aryeh Leibowitz, Shea Shachter, Menachem Penner, and Larry Rothwax, discussing the kinds of challenges and communal questions that Rabbanim were never trained for, never prepared to encounter, and are now facing head-on in today's world. Plus, a powerful session with Shabbos Kestenbaum and Nate Buzz, where you'll walk away genuinely inspired by a non-Jew who reminds you just how lucky you are to be a Jew. You'll also hear from Rabbi Shais Taub, Rabbi David Bashevkin, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, Rabbi Shlomo Katz, and Rabbi Moshe Weinberger, each bringing their own depth, heart, and clarity on a range of topics, including addiction, abuse, and mental health. And for lighter moments, there are brand new comedy segments with Ami Kozak and Dovi Neuberger, plus the Tiny Studio music series featuring Eitan Katz, Joey Newcomb, Yankee Lemmer, and others. The live portions of the program will once again be hosted by Nachum Siegel. If you're into thoughtful Torah conversations, honest discussions about mental health and community, and hearing from some of the most interesting Jewish voices today, you're going to want to tune in. UniteToHeal.com, and you can find the link in the show notes. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, you can email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or find the link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and so on, as well as a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer it that way. And also, you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And also, if you can please rate the podcast if you listen on Apple. And with that, enjoy this fascinating episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Deborah Kaplan, who is the Samuel Braun Chair for the History of the Jews in Germany at Bar-Ilan University, and by Professor Elisheva Kalbach, who is the Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society at Columbia University. And I'll be discussing with them their newly co-authored book, A Woman is Responsible for Everything, Jewish Woman in Early Modern Europe. So thank you both for joining me again on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so this book, as we're going to discuss, outlines the lives of Jewish women in early modern Europe, which we'll define as 1500 to 1800. But I'll let you guys talk more on that. I just want to say what time period it is that we're really discussing here on this book and this episode. But how did this book come to be in general? And then I guess and how did you come to co-author the book, because you wrote the book together?
So it's interesting. Many years ago, we both taught a class together at Queens College on Jewish women in the early modern period. And for that course, we started translating primary sources from our own materials to use together with our students. So it sort of started there.
We both were told by our respective mentors that a history like this could not be written because there were no sources. And we each were surprised to see that as we worked on other projects, rich materials came up time and again, and eventually we just decided that we would team up and make it the focus of a joint effort.
And if you can imagine this co-authoring process, it really began in some ways when we sat in archives side by side. We were working on parallel projects in Jerusalem, in New York, in Europe, but mostly in Jerusalem. And wherever we looked, whatever we were working on, we always found material. And that's really the way that we started working together, sitting side by side and getting really excited when we would turn a page and find yet another thing and yet another thing. And it just kept going from there.
It was a work of many years. We used many different archives, as Deborah said, all over the world almost, and not to mention many online sources. This was a work that took us through a pandemic, across an ocean, a horrible war. And what kept us going was the pull of the material itself, the voices and lives of so many creative and wonderful Jewish women without whom there would never have been the life of the Kehillah the way we saw it.
And that's going to be important as we discuss what the Kehillah is. But like I said, we're going to get to shortly, the breadth of these sources. For those of you that have read this book or will hear about this book, I mean, going through this book, I was blown away by the amount of material that you've collected and just writing down just chapter after chapter. It's just the so much material from so many rich and varied sources, which is fascinating. But let's turn to the time period, I think, just to outline right in the beginning. Is the time period, as I mentioned, it's 1500 to 1800, what we term the early modern period. You may want to define that for listeners. Like, what early modern period, what does that mean? 1500, 1800, like, why'd you pick these dates? What's going on in the world? Just define, give a little bit of a definition, a context, if you will, before we dive into the topic.
Sure. The early modern period it's a sort of funny name because it's early modern. What does that really mean? What it means is it's not the Middle Ages anymore. We're right after the expulsions of the Middle Ages in Western Europe and the depopulation of many cities, which comes after the Black Plague. And what we see are the rise of new kehillot in different places. It could be in villages in Germany. It could be in cities from which Jews were expelled and returned. It could be in cities in which the Jews remained but had a new configuration, sometimes living in a ghetto. It could be in a new city altogether where there was no more Jewish population. There had not been a previous Jewish population, and they moved there. So this is very much our start date. It's before the formal modern period, but after the medieval period for that 300 years. And we start at the beginning, at 1500. That's really when the period starts.
So it's important to note that when we use the term Kehillah, we're not just referring to a random collection of Jews who happen to reside in the same place. We're talking about a very formal structure, and this is the period in which Kehillot began to become far more sophisticated and ramified. There's a framework for Jewish life in which there are elections, lay leadership. It was not communities governed by rabbinic leadership. Rabbis are hired, but it's lay people who are running the communities. They establish tax collection and look over it, and so forth. Every aspect of Jewish life becomes more formalized within this new, very hierarchical structure that includes every Jew in the area. But it's not a random thing. It's very, very structured.
And I would say as part of that structure, we have all of a sudden a tremendous amount of record keeping about everything. And we can talk more about that when we talk about our sources. But just to note now, in this period, we just have an abundance of sources, all kinds of records, manuscripts, printed materials, visual materials. And we can talk a little bit about the images that we included in the book and the images we didn't include in the book. And there's also material culture that we talk about. There are actual remnants of life in this period that are preserved until today in museums. So we have all of these different kinds of sources. That's part of what makes this period so exciting.
And it's important to say, just as we didn't pick the dates randomly, but we looked at the time of the flourishing of formal kehillot, there's one other very important development that characterizes this period, and that's true for all of Europe, but for Jews in particular, and that is the rise of print culture. Now, even though some of our sources are in manuscript, the fact that books, and I have to say it's not only the printing press, but also the arrival of cheaper paper. You don't have to print on parchment anymore, means that people had access to far more material, and even women could build literacy Jewish women began to read. They had their own printed materials, a siddur, a chumash, everything, a novel. And that spread of literacy and through the technology of print and paper made a huge difference in this period, and is one of the things that really marks it as distinct from the medieval period.
And I think what we'll get to maybe a bit later is this idea that all of this literacy and all of these kinds of texts, and we'll specify more, really influenced women's participation in Jewish communal life on a daily basis. So that's sort of the framework of the period, why we started there. Elisheva, I don't know if you want to say a word about why we ended in 1800.
Yeah, so what is it? Again, we didn't just pick the dates out of a hat, although obviously nobody wakes up the next morning and says, oh, I'm not early modern anymore. Now I'm modern. But around the year 1800, so towards the end of the 18th and through the beginning of the 19th century, it's the end of the Kehillah as an autonomous institution with real, what Professor Magda Teder called delegated authority or delegated governance that Jewish authorities could wield. Today, Jews still have Kehillot, but it's voluntary to be a member of them. In those days when membership was not voluntary, there's a holistic way of life that's supervised, that everybody belongs to. And this way of life, although it showed certain fissures already in the late 18th century, it was completely dismantled with the arrival of emancipation and with Jews having civic equality. So for us, that entry of Jews into the larger society, into universities and professions, and the entire idea that your being an observant Jew is yours to voluntarily undertake, but not imposed upon you, changes everything in foundational ways. And we decided that that was a good point to end the book.
It's something that we'll explore more, and I've done podcasts with both of you, and for listeners to can check those out, and we really discuss more of this there as well, where you really, the Kehillah, the life of the Kehillah, you were part of it. There was no opt-out choice. I mean, that's you see people converting to Christianity. This was before really just opting out and off the derech type, mainly at the time. It was just, or going to Reform or other denominations. It was, are you part of the Kehillah or not? And as we're going to see throughout this episode, and something that you discuss very in depth in the book, all that comes with, right? Your seat in shul and being part of the Kehillah, and some places being allowed to get, getting married, and the cemetery, and so on and so forth. Just everything is part of the Kehillah. Now, one thing I also want to ask you is, geographically, where are we talking about? I mean, in this book, you're covering a large amount of time, so it's 1500 to 1800. I don't know if you can give an overview of what was going on in Europe for 300 years, but roughly speaking, where are we discussing here in this book?
So we chose to focus on Western and Central Europe, and the way, and on Ashkenazi communities, which are the communities that both of us work on, because there were also some Sephardic communities in these areas, but we did not deal with them. So we're dealing with communities from in the West. Metz is probably as far west as we go, in Amsterdam, and in the east to Prague. And then in the north, we go into Copenhagen, and in the south, we go into northern Italy, which may surprise some of the listeners, but northern Italy in this time period is a really important place for Ashkenazi and Yiddish culture. So that's really it's a very large area, and we covered cities and also villages and all kinds of different kehillot. But that's the big geographic range that we discuss in this book. So it's a big time period and a big slice of Europe, but it's not the East. It's the West and Central Europe.
So excluding Poland, which Professor Moshe Rossman is writing about or wrote about, and really excluding the New World, we really focused on Western and Central Europe.
And as you mentioned, Ashkenazi community. So when it comes to Amsterdam, which has Ashkenazi and Sephardi community, or Hamburg, you mainly skip the Sephardi communities, just focus on the Ashkenazi communities there?
That's correct. We skipped the Sephardic community because it's a different culture. It's a different linguistic basis. It just, and very interestingly, the overlap inside the records is absolutely minimal. There are There are mentions, but they're really very, very marginal. And we feel that historians who have the expertise in those languages and in those archives are the ones who should do that work.
Also, I'll say, as a reader, this book is, with the notes and everything, about 450 pages, but that doesn't do justice. The amount of material in here could be like a 1,000-page book. So if you would add more sources and more potential sources, it would be, I mean, who knows how big and who knows how many, sources, how many different stories would be in here. So that would be like a lot. Okay, so let's talk about let's talk a little bit more about the type of sources. And usually that's the type of question, I'm sure listeners are like, wait, do that at the end. Why are you talking about the type of sources now? That's like boring. Let's talk about what actually was going on. No, because it's so important to discuss the type of sources. As you mentioned some of them, you used so many different varied sources of print, manuscript, but let's even go further than that and talk about what type of print are we talking about, what type of manuscripts. Pinkasim, where Professor Kalbach, we did a few years ago a podcast on Pinkasim, so we discussed it there. But I think, again, to highlight, like, what is a Pinkas? What is that? What type of Pinkasim are we discussing? I think to tell the listener, like, where you got the material from would be important here.
Okay, so Pinkasim are one out of about a dozen genres of primary sources, maybe more, that we call upon quite frequently. And these are essentially community records, Jewish community records, usually written in Hebrew/Yiddish, and sometimes other languages thrown in, logbooks that Sofer HaKahal, or whatever, they had different designations, but it was this person charged by the lay leadership to keep records of the important business of the Kehila. So they are compiled at the behest of a lay leadership by a trained sofer, not a sofer stam, but somebody who is a so-called civic scribe. And I should add that there are all kinds of records that people are discussing and that we sometimes had access to. For example, every businessman kept their own personal pinkas, and every businesswoman. And we see a lot of reference, for example, in the records of Batei Din, and we also use Beit Din records. For example, they would say, well, let the woman bring her pinkas in and let us see, what she recorded as having been owed or paid. And that's Maaseh Yom Yom. That's a standard practice. Vital records. Nobody kept vital records in those days. There was no official bureau, but every mohel had a pinkas mohel in which he recorded every single milah that he performed, and every midwife. And the midwife records are actually more important because they record both male and female births, the mohalim obviously not. And we found several midwife records. And they're amazing. These are the personal pinkasim of women who were formally hired by a Jewish community to be their midwives.
And so I would say even we used other sources that were not just in Pinkasim, or could be found sometimes in Pinkasim and other places as well. So one example is wills. We found certain Pinkasim that were collections of copies of wills. So the Kehila maintained copies of individuals' wills. And in there we found women's wills, married women, widows, even single women, maidservants. So we found many different kinds of women's wills. And we found other documents that I think are very familiar to listeners, different shtarot, different contracts that mark engagements. So Tnaim Rishonim and Tnaim Achronim, premarital contracts, of course, marital arrangements and ktubot. Elisheva already mentioned court records. In addition to the Batei Din, there were small claims courts and other Jewish courts, and of course, non-Jewish courts where we found Jewish women and Jewish men and all kinds of combinations appearing before the court, litigating all kinds of interesting matters. And then we also found some really interesting material that we might call printed ephemera, the kinds of material that you wouldn't even imagine had survived. So lists of gifts that someone got for their wedding, and then all of a sudden you're in a young couple's home and understanding what kind of plates they have, what kind of spoons, they have a coffee maker, they have chocolate dishes. We found wedding invitations. We found all kinds of things, and also manuscripts, benchers, sidrei brachot, all kinds of different collections. of really, really interesting material.
And we also used what we would call visual and material texts. So it's not just the things that are written, but we found a tremendous number of both manuscript and printed works. For example, Sidrei Brachot, a Seder of the Brachot, became what seems to have been a kind of very standard wedding gift that were often given by husbands or future husbands to wives, with beautiful depictions of the minutiae of women's lives. And we include many of these illustrations, but they also bring us into the homes, into the lives. They show us what people were wearing. They were just an amazing source for us. Tikkunei Shabbat. Again, beautiful illustrations of what the family looked like sitting at the table. Another totally different type of source, which we use and sometimes read against the grain, are the illustrations in works by Christian Hebraists, Christian scholars who are describing Jewish life for an audience that's very curious for this exotica. And sometimes they hire very skilled artisans to draw from life. What did a shul look like? What did a Jewish wedding procession look like? What did a chalitza look like? Amazing depictions. And we use those as visual texts to try to enrich our material. And those are visual sources. There are also material sources, actual objects that survive. So, for example, the Frankfurt Jewish Museum has hats that women sewed and wore in the early modern period. Pots. People used to carry their cholent pot to the communal oven every Erev Shabbat. And in order that the pots not get mixed up, women had their names engraved outside the pot. This is an amazing source because we can identify individual people. We could sometimes link them up to other sources. And it tells us that the women knew how to read their pots, at least. And another thing we should talk about are textiles. Women sewed parochot, mapot, matzah covers, challah covers. Many of these things have survived. Little girls sewed samplers with their name and the aleph beis. There's so much material out there that helped us construct this picture. So we think that there was just a very wide variety of sources to draw on.
I want to even just add a couple of sources that some of which we can find in other periods and some of which we can't. Letters. We have beautiful letters written by and to women. Of course, we have rabbinic responsa, as we do for other periods. And finally, maybe special to our period is the communal memorbook, which is a communal memorial book that lists the names of the dead community members, both male and female, with little entries, some longer than others. As time goes on, the entries get longer. And these would be read in shul on Shabbat. And so you have a sense of what people did in their lives, remembering men and women for their charitable deeds, for the chesed that they did, for their membership in different confraternities. And therefore, we have hundreds, if not thousands of names of women with small descriptions of the things that they did. And of course, we have to read these very carefully, but it's an amazing thing to be able to look at this. And we looked at some of the memorabilia together with tombstones and court records and all kinds of other things. And when you cross-reference them, all of a sudden you're looking at a person's life. And it's an amazing, amazing thing to be able to do for women hundreds of years ago, to know their names and be able to map out what it is they did and how they participated in the kehillah.
You mentioned there are tombstones. I was going to mention, and that's something you point out in the book, though, is that tombstones, and some of these stories I've taken with a grain of salt because people want to portray themselves one way after they died on their tombstone. It's not always 100% how maybe they were or weren't. I mean, all these. We'll get to that. Also, you mentioned chuvas. That you use plenty of those, especially Yehuda Meller is like a favorite of yours in the book. People might think of Yehuda Miller if they know the Mechon Yerushalayim chuva sefer that they have of his. There's a couple others that you have in here. Some really fascinating responsa that you go through as well. So there's really, like you said, a lot of different sources that are used. And the book, I think at this point we should at least mention right here, we're not right at the beginning, but before we even get to the end, is that there's many illustrations in the book. I mean, you guys probably know the number of, there's a large amount of color pictures included in this book and some that are not color. And just looking at that, like you said, you really can see the depiction of what it looked like, or at least how they visualize themselves when they're putting these pictures. There also was, I thought it was really fascinating to see, and I went to show my wife when they had like the little, I don't know how you print, like the thing with the Volvo, you could have, like when they're doing laundry, and they had a little thing on which day it was. I thought that was fascinating to see, and they have this like cheshbon of what they're doing laundry on, what they're, what item of laundry they're doing on which day of the month, and just so many other different things that you show in here to portray, the woman playing cards on Rosh Chodesh. You see them all dressed up and playing cards. Now, those type of things, when we see visual aids and visual sources, do they change? Because as you say, you're going from Central Europe to Western Europe to Northern Europe to North Italy. Do they change the depiction of the woman and of the lives? Do they I assume they did, but they look differently from place to place. Do you see that in the sources?
Well, I think one does see differences, cultural differences. And what we try to do here is to open up a discussion and to let people, both lay people, anybody who's interested in Jewish history really, as well as professional historians, understand that this is a chapter in Jewish history that has simply not been opened before. Practically for every single footnote we have in this book, you could write an article or a book. There's so much more material that we ourselves could have potentially included, but for lack of time and space, we couldn't. We were very selective. And one of the things we didn't do is say, well, this kind of headdress was unique to the women of Prague or the women of Northern Italy. It would have moved us in a direction, again, that there's just no end to it. So we didn't make those distinctions, but they could be made and they should be made, hopefully by others who will come after us and pick up some of what we opened here and run with it.
Yeah, we definitely could have, you could have done more. And as we discussed before we started recording this, I'm like, wait, we could do like a whole miniseries on this. There's so much material here in this, small, when you think about it, small book, because it could have been so much bigger. So let's talk about how you do use these sources, because there's so much material. How do you use these sources?
So we understand that what we look at, whether it's a tombstone, whether it's a will, whether it's a birth record, every source we have is a fragment and only tells us a little piece of a whole life. And what we have tried to do is contextualize them in their larger cultural sphere. And in some cases, we're very lucky and fortunate that we have several different types of sources that we can build up for the life of a particular woman, and in some cases, very important women. So, for example, I'll give one example, and then Professor Kaplan can give you another example of how we did that. There's a woman in Prague in the 17th century by the name of Bella Perlhefter. We both loved to read about her because there were so many different ways in which we got to know her. Her letters were so beautifully written and constructed that a Christian Hebraist, Johann Christoph Wagenseil, collected them. And in the early 2000s, I went to the city of Leipzig shortly after the wall came down and you could travel to East Germany. And I saw her actual letters collected in this volume that this professor in Altdorf had collected to teach his students how Jews write letters. So 4 letters from between Bella Perlhefter and her husband Bear are preserved in that collection. She also wrote the introduction and clearly had a large influence on the contents itself of a vast encyclopedia of Jewish thought called Be'er Sheva. And from her introduction to Be'er Sheva, we learn that Bella had 7 children who died in her lifetime. It's an absolutely heartbreaking thing. And she is one of the first women to write that she would like to leave this literary legacy, this encyclopedia called Elisheva, in memory of her 7 children. So we learn from the manuscript of Elisheva that she herself was a member of the Prague Chevra Kadisha. And we have several other sources about Bella and her husband Bear that allow us to really build up a sense of the life of this person. She was an entrepreneur. She wrote letters for other women who were not so literate but needed to send missives to their family members or whoever, would come to her and they would say, could you write a letter to this and this effect? And she writes about that. So here we have a person who was enormously learned, a very important member of her Kehila as a member of the Chevra Kadisha, and someone who used her literary advantage to try to establish a memorial for her children who were lost.
So we could name many women like these who we could find throughout various sources. I'll bring a very different example of a woman from a different class, a woman named Yitta, who was born in what's today Denmark, Fredericia, a small town. And we first stumbled across her when we worked through a Pinkas of wills from Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, Kihilat Ahu. And the community had a copy of her will because she was serving as a maidservant in Altona. And we had this will, but we wanted to know more about Yitta. And we started searching in other records. We found her in the burial records, and not just her, but the family for whom she worked. So we started to get a picture. The mother of the family had died with young children, and she was taking care of the children, and sort of explained to us the kinds of bequests she was making to some of the children of those families. And then we found how the courts in Altona dealt with the execution of her will. We also looked through Kehila records from Fredericia to try to place her in a matrix, and we found her brother learning in Elisheva. So we were able to all of a sudden map out the life of this otherwise anonymous maidservant who left us with this will, and all of a sudden we could see her relationship with her employers, we could see her relationship to her brothers, to her nieces, and also what was important to her at the end of her life when she started thinking about what charities to support, where she wanted to be buried. And all these details were available to us by using these sources and cross-referencing them. So it was quite exciting to all of a sudden be able to reconstruct the lives of women such as these.
And really, there are so many women. And as you say, there are some, well, you talk about in the book, there are some outstanding women. I think, I don't know if we've mentioned Glickle yet, and some are probably thinking, well, where is Glickle? She's the woman in this time period. How'd you leave her out? So that's something that you discuss, that you don't only want to mention exceptional women, and those that we have kind of sources about. But you do mention Glickle, so perhaps you want to address that as well, like mentioning Glickle or other quote-unquote exceptional women that we know about.
So we do mention Glickle, and one of the Kehilot that both of us have worked on in our own projects was Kehilat Ahu, and Glickle was from there. And so, of course, her memoir, we didn't list in our sources, but we did use her memoir as well as the memoirs of other people, especially rabbis, who wrote about the women of their family. So that's parenthetically. And we see exceptional women like Bella, like Glickle, like Rivka Tiktiner, who was a 16th century woman from Prague who wrote the very first Sefer Musar written by a woman, and it was published right after her death in the early 17th century. So we have these really exceptional women. And I would add, because I mentioned the memoirs, that some of the famous rabbinic figures of the period described in the introductions to their Sfarim or in their own personal memoirs, the women of their family and how extraordinarily educated and well-read they were. So whether it's the grandmother of the Chavos Yair, for whom he named his book, Chava, and he talks about how learned she was, we see glimpses of these women. And we can also find references to this on the women's tombstones. If you take a Rebbitzin's tombstone, you'll find all kinds of very exciting things. And these are people that we know much better. So we have those women in our text. One of the things we said, Glickle, as you said, she's the one that everyone knows. And it was important to us not to write a book just about the exceptional women, but specifically to capture the lives of the average women and women of different classes. And so that's really what we tried to do in the book.
But
Yes.
you do discuss. You do discuss Glickl and also someone like Rivka Tiktiner who wrote Midnight Against Rivka. Like, you do discuss the exceptional ones as well, besides the ordinary ones. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add a very small note. I don't know if you caught this, but in our sources, most of the time, the members of the Kehila who have some responsibility for its running are called Balei Bayit, the Balabas. And that bet abbreviation is ubiquitous in the sources, and it always refers to the men who are Balabatim. But we decided to flip that and to look at the so-called Balot Bayit, the women who are upholding the Kehila, not just by the way they're running their own homes and raising their children, but also by their contributions to the life of the Kehila. That was very important to us.
Maybe I'll give one quick example. And this is an interesting one because it sort of falls in between Glickl, who people have heard of, or Chava, grandmother of the Chavos Yair, and Yitta, maidservant, who, we have heard of, and anyone who read our book now understands that we think she's really great. There's a woman in Frankfurt who dies in 1728, and her name is Rechla Drach. And actually, her husband is very important. He's a Gabbai Tzedakah in this very big community, a charity collector. And her father is very important because he represents Frankfurt's Jewish community before the emperor. So this is a family that, for people who work on Frankfurt, they know the Drach family, but they don't know Rechla. And Rechla herself is so interesting. She doesn't have a formal job, but she delivers babies, and she's part of the Chevra Kadisha, and she procures medicine for the people of the community. She sews parochot and blankets and tzitzis for the community. And with all of that, she also goes to shul every single day, early in the morning, late at night. She has 2 children. She has 8 grandchildren. These are things that we were able to map together, mostly from the Memor Buch, but also from the Pinkas, also from the tombstones, also from genealogical records. And taken all together, we see a woman who, while she had no official position in the Frankfurt community, she was critical. She was vital. You could not have survived in Frankfurt without a woman like Rechla. We opened the book with her, who really was with people from childbirth until death. And it's an amazing thing. And these are the stories we seek to tell. So she's a great example of a Balas Bayit.
It's interesting. You mentioned there also that woman going to shul even during the week. I think many people think of, a woman goes to shul on Shabbos or Yom Tov maybe. No, you see they go to shul. You have that story with a fight that happens between a man and a woman, and like they come to the Rav or the Bezin. I don't remember exactly. Like that happened during the week. That was what the source is. That the woman was going to shul during the week, and that's a fascinating thing to see as well. That many may not be familiar, may not have assumed happened.
Right. We see women going to shul on a daily basis, and we have this across various sources. So it's very clear that was the case.
And across various communities. And that's just one tiny example of the many daily life experiences that people assume didn't happen because nobody knew about it. But in fact, we come across many important things. The contributions that women made to the economic life of their families, for example, and their communities, something that most people don't know very much about. But our sources tell us that women were very active in contributing to the economic lives of their families, from the poorest women to the wealthiest women. Women did not just stay in the home. The image that everybody before 1950 lived as a kind of housefrau and did not contribute to the economic life of their families is completely opposed by our sources. We found women doing such interesting and entrepreneurial things. We found a woman in Prague who organized like a mail carrying service with her husband between Prague and Vienna, with rates for how much it costs, depending on what you wanted to send along in the letter. And we found actual lists between her and her husband that she kept of what was sent to whom and how much, whether the recipient sent something back. We found all kinds of interesting and entrepreneurial women.
Yeah, and I'd say of all classes, you and I have talked in the past about charity and the poor, and we find women involved in the hektish, in the sort of hospital, hospice, but also hostel for foreign travelers. And of course, this makes sense. If somebody was ill, if there was a woman who was ill or a woman who was giving birth, as long as we think about it logically, we understand, well, a woman would have been in charge of giving her medical care or of delivering the baby. That would not have been a job for a man. That would not have been appropriate for the modesty of the Jewish community. And so we have these women who worked in the hektish. We found one family with 3 generations working in the hektish of Vienna. And it's like a whole elaborate story of the records that they kept and how they maintained their own inventories and what happened when they died and what happened to their small property. And we're talking about very poor women. Wealthy women didn't work in the hektish. We're talking about not the volunteers from the upper class, the poor women. We have their names, we have their records, and it's amazing that they were keeping records, that they were involved in inventorying the property of other women. So we have amazing finds from all different classes.
So it's good you started speaking about this already. I wanted to ask you, what were the lives of ordinary women? What were their ordinary lives like? What were their professions like? What did they do? What about just in general professionally, and their families to make money? And what about in the kehila? They sewed tachrichim, they were sewing burial shrouds, they were doing other things, they were helping out in the shul and the men's shul and the women's section. What were they doing in both? And if you could just speak a little more, some more examples to listeners to get a feel. And this is something you discuss throughout the book, that anyone read the book will understand more of, but if you can give a little flavor here.
So a lot depended on class. We found women in the highest ranks, the wealthiest women, who were very active in the enterprise. For example, Glickel herself seamlessly took over a very expansive, ramified business that her husband had been involved in on a very high level. She was daily involved in every aspect of the business. And we found this throwaway line in her memoir in which she writes, the man was giving us certain types of conditions, and I said, let me sit down and write a contract. And since my husband wasn't there to write it, I sat down and I drew up a contract. She was able to write a legal contract with someone else on her own with no preparation. And it's a throwaway line, but this is something she was deeply involved in, totally mastered, and was able to run through the rest of her life. And that's something we see, for example, in the wills of both moneyed and ordinary women. They tell us about how they want the business aspect of their lives to be divided after their death. They were running things, even though very often the husband signed. Business in most families was a partnership between both spouses, and the women were deeply involved. And there are many examples, again, from Madame Kaula, who we profiled because she was such an extraordinary supporter in her. She was not just the purveyor of arms and goods to the princes in her region, but she also supported the klois, like the kollel in her place, and sometimes women who do that have very specific wishes about what they want to be learned in honor of their neshamot, and those are the women at the upper reaches. And we found women who engage in very petty trade, such as women who were selling thread, women who were rural women selling milk and chicks. Women were deeply involved in upholding the families economically, and women who had the means in upholding all kinds of institutions throughout the Kehillah.
That, see, their economic life, if you want, we can move a little bit to the question of the role they played in the Kehillah. Some of those roles were more formal. So like I mentioned, the hektish attendants, or somebody could be a shomer for a cemetery. And these would have been jobs that were paid and often taken on by the poor. But there were also roles that were more informal. I'll give one that was not informal first, and that is a question of women running the mikvah. And this is a useful place maybe to think about the difference between the Middle Ages and the early modern period that we mentioned earlier at the start of the podcast. In the Middle Ages, when a woman went to the mikvah, it was informal. If we read Sefer Hasidim, it seems that another woman would accompany her, but it wasn't set. There wasn't what we would call a mikvah lady or a balanit. And all of a sudden, in the early modern period, part of the formalization and increased structure and bureaucracy of the kihila, the mikvah itself becomes formalized. The kihila leadership wants women to go to a particular mikvah, whether a newly constructed mikvah near a shul, or even a specific mikvah in the house is designated as the kahalasha mikvah, the mikvah of the community. And if you think about it, of course, a man is not going to be in charge of making sure the women are immersing. He's not going to be there. He's not going to collect the newly instated fees that are now instituted for a woman who is immersing. And he's not going to keep the records of who paid money when she has to do, when the person in charge, which is a woman, has to sit down with the leadership of the kahal and say, well, how much does she get and how much do they get? So we have women running mikvaot in various communities with complicated financial agreements, like a franchise in some places with the kahal, and they must have kept, we haven't found it, but we know they must have kept wonderful records of how much money they took in. So this formalization gave a woman an official role. We also have unofficial roles, so like charity collectors. We have women whose job it is to collect tzedakah in the women's section. Again, a place that men don't go. The male gabbai tzedakah doesn't go into the women's section. So when the women are coming to shul all the time and they want to give tzedakah and they want to give their charity, they give it to a female official. And we found gabatas, the female form of gabbai, in Prague, appointed along with the men, listed in the Pinkas by name for every year. So it's clear these positions that they held in the community, both voluntary and also sometimes official and paid.
What about women on the margins? That's something you discuss in the book as well.
Our thesis we found amazing women, including, in some cases, women who were accused of various crimes. Some of these crimes, like the one we opened the chapter with, like the woman who was accused of murdering her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law. These are very rare. I think this is the only woman who was charged with murder, not just among the Jews, but I think even in Hamburg generally in this century. It's not a usual thing, but women were sometimes involved in crimes for various reasons. In this case, it may have been mental instability or emotional breakdown. We're not sure. There are many different views of what led her to do that. We see women in gangs of thieves. And we see women, again, whose lives, even not in criminal marginality, but who are so poor or so unhoused and unrooted in any particular community because of various reasons, that they literally live on the margins. They go from kehila to kehila, seeking a few nights of respite and a warm meal, and sometimes a night in the hekdesh, medical treatment they might need. And what we've discovered is that there's no such thing as a Jewish person who is not in some way tied to the Jewish community. That means even the poorest, even the most indigent, the biggest vagrant who has no roots in any place, nevertheless has to come to the kehila at various times in their lives. There is a kind of deep bond between the kehila and every Jewish person that comes within its network, regardless of their status. So even when we say marginal, we don't mean totally beyond the boundaries of the kehila.
Something also that you discussed, obviously you mentioned, Deborah, you mentioned the mikvah there. So we discussed daily life of women going throughout it. Starting with marriage. You discussed the marriage, the process itself, shadchanim, and one can imagine that was a deal then also. It's not a new thing. This has been going on. So you discussed that, dowry, life after marriage, marital strife, divorce. You see that as well in the sources. death, women becoming widows. What happens to the widows? You mentioned Glickle. She takes over her husband's business. Her husband dies, she takes over. I mean, that's one story that we know of, and so on and so forth. So there's really a lot of these things that you mention and discuss at length as well in the book.
Yes, we really try to think about women's marital status as another factor that impacted their lives, and to show the different roles that they played at different stages in their lives. The women that stayed single but were lending money, who they lived with, the family members that they had. Widows, you mentioned Glickle, who was wealthy. We also found very poor widows who, after their husbands passed away, were really struggling. We found married women who were very happy and married women who were very frustrated. One of my favorite sources is when one of the courts tells a couple, nobody's parents can come visit because the meddling parents are creating the marital strife. And when they want to know what's going on, they say, we're going to ask the neighbors. So it just gives you a sense, really, that daily life, the shouting that might have been heard, the lack of privacy, the family dynamics, things that I think really resonate as ordinary daily interactions that we come across because they were recorded in our sources, which is, it's like a treasure every single time that we stumbled across.
You mentioned wills. So wills, you can have a will like people think of a will today. You leave your possessions over and how you delegate different things, but also you have an ethical will, which we're familiar sometimes with Rabbanim. Maybe they say, give a will to the family. This is what you should do. So you had women wrote ethical wills as well. That's another source that you came upon and used as well. There's material wills, like sumptuary laws, like what, there's takanas, if you will, people might be familiar with today, right? What you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do materially. This is something that happened then as well in the community. In fact, maybe even more, because then the community, as you mentioned, you were part of the Kehillah. The Kehillah had complete control over you, not like today.
Well, the wills were very interesting because so many of these families are multiple times blended, and therefore people were very concerned about being fair to the various sets of offspring from one spouse and a second spouse, depending on which way it went. They sometimes are very emotional documents, wills. We found one woman who said, I'm not leaving anything to my sons because my husband was such a terrible provider. He left me with absolutely nothing, not even the basics that he promised. And therefore, I'm leaving my entire legacy to my daughter, just to kind of get back at the men in my life who didn't provide for me. So you could see a lifelong frustration of this woman built up and expressed in her will. We see a shidduch crisis in some places because Jews were limited in the number of marriages that legally could take place in certain parts of the early modern world. And so singles remain unmarried. In some cases, they marry kind of secretly, but if they're found out, they're fined very strongly, and the authorities don't like it. We found many different things. Women who die in childbirth shortly after they get married, and the practice already since I think the times of Rabbeinu Tam, that the husband and the wife then get back part of what they brought into the marriage. The dowry goes back to the father of the young woman if she's the one who died, and so forth. So we found many interesting practices that are not as well known today, but were, again, daily life practices in the early modern period.
So how did you compile and construct this book, if you will, using this primary source material, this vast primary source material, and we've touched on the tip of the iceberg here in this episode?
So there are many, many different ways of organizing this book, and the one you have in front of you is not necessarily the only one it could have been. But I want to say that what this book actually began as was the two of us sitting side by side in archival collections, working on various things and saying, you have to see what we just found. Look at this amazing text about a woman in Kehillah X or Y. And we began to compile our primary sources. This book actually began as a collection of primary sources where we could allow everyone to see what material exists And we went through many different possibilities, and eventually we settled upon this one as the best way to open the material, but it's certainly not the only possible one.
Who would you say this book is meant for? I know you mentioned earlier that really it could be for anybody, but was that the intent in writing the book and publishing the book?
So I'll maybe say that what our aim was. I want you to imagine that we're sitting in the archive and we're working and we're so excited about everything we find, and we're literally finding things everywhere. You heard about the sources we have. I just thought of another one that we didn't mention, which was a Sefer Minhagim. We worked on many Sefer Minhagim, on custom books, printed ones, manuscript, illustrated ones. So just throwing that out there, there's so much everywhere you look. And faced with all this material, our aim was really to uncover these amazing lives and sources. And what we wanted to do was to take our readers along for the thrill of discovering how much we can know about Jewish women in these times and the details of their lives.
I want to add, this is not just a book for women. It is a book for everybody who is interested in the Jewish past, in Jewish history, people who are interested in how Jews live their lives, intelligent readers of all kinds. And we hope that scholars who read it become more alert and attentive to these figures and these voices, and try to build upon some of the things that we opened up here but couldn't really pursue.
I'll add to that I posted this a few times on the WhatsApp community. And I recommended it. I said, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent book, which I'll say here it is. I read the book. It's excellent. And some people were like, well, it's feminist. Like, what are you posting? And people are like, no, it's feminist. Maybe it's feminist in a positive way. It's explaining the lives of women and what the lives were like. And you're uncovering what those were like and what the lives of Jews were like. And there are a lot of men in this book as well, by the way, throughout the book. And it just explores what the lives were like. And sometimes, even from the male angle, we read books or Sfarim, and we don't know what the lives of men were like. We don't know what the lives of Jewish families and Jewish people were like in the early modern period, like what was actually going on. And through these sources, you can understand a lot of that. And so it's a fascinating, eye-opening read for that. And as you mentioned, and you wrote this in the book as well, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You're just trying to start charting people towards the right directions, to write articles and books and to write much more micro histories, if you will, I guess, than this macro history. So I will include a link in the show notes to the book. It's $39 and change. So I think and I want to mention, I told this to Princeton, and I'll say this live on the podcast. Princeton still does a wonderful job of the actual physical book is a real binding, a really nice binding. Unfortunately, many books today, and for those that are book buyers will know what I'm talking about, are print on demand. Basically, they take like a paperback and they slap on two boards. It's very poor quality print. So this is really high quality. There's many color photos, many other illustrations. So for that price, I mean, you can't buy a novel like for that price anymore. Any safer is like over $30 today. Also, I'll link to Amazon for those that like purchasing books that way, which I know are many, but I'll also link to Princeton's website where you can use code P327 for 30% off. I'll put that information in the show notes so you can get 30% off if you want to buy it through Princeton. And thank you both for joining me to talk about the new book, A Woman is Responsible for Everything.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, it's always a pleasure.